Hello, my name is Dejan Boshkov, Grandmaster from Bulgaria. Today we shall talk about the main danger that the black pieces experience in the Berlin, and this is the breakthrough e5 to e6 that white can possibly do. Why is this so bad for the second player? First of all, the main reason for this is the Berlin itself. On a very early stage, when black was exchanging the queens, he had to move with the king, which means that he had lost the castling option. And now the king stays in the center. It's very difficult. It's actually impossible to castle in either side. And because of that, that king might be in danger in the center of the board. Moreover, it is not letting the black rooks to get connected, and they can be kind of excluded from the game on their initial squares, either on h8 or on a8. That's why e6 breakthrough is something that black should always be aware of, and he shouldn't allow it in most of the cases. The first sample that we're going to see is the game Shirov as white against Karakin. Alexei Shirov is one of the great specialists of the attacking chess, and he usually likes to play this e5, e6 stuff. And here in that game, such a moment occurred. He didn't hesitate long. He played e6, which is giving some hard time for black. First of all, he's opening the lines for the rooks. Now we can see that this is something additional that white had from the opening. The pawn on e5 is simply taken off the board, and both the rooks start to work very well on the open files. In the game, Karakin took back with the bishop. Probably a bit more stubborn would have been to take back with the pawn, but still in that case he's having problems. White is not going to take back the pawn immediately, as this will give chance for the second player to bring the king in safety, and after that to connect the rooks, starting to trade the rooks. This will be okay position for him, but instead he would rather like to keep the king in the center, and most probably he will play a move like bishop to f2. The threat is knight f5, then the g7 pawn will start to hang, and let's say that if black pushes the pawn forward to e5, white can take it anytime, first of all, but in that case also there will be a hunting season starting. Let's say rook takes e5. Now the king has to go to g6, and then we have problems with the g7 pawn after rook coming to e7. For example, rook g8, rook d1, attacking the bishop, and once that the bishop retreats, bishop to c8, then rook takes g7. And there are too many pieces hanging in that line. After rook takes d8, the bishop is hanging and the rook is hanging. White not only won a pawn, he's going to win some extra material in addition. If he doesn't play e5, if he just sticks to the passive defense, let's say he plays rook f8, taking control over the f5 square. Again, white is not obliged to take the pawn on e6. He can do it, but there is no need of doing that. Bishop a3, keeping the initiative, will be very nasty for the second player. For example, now in case of rook f7, he can finally take the pawn, as this is winning on the spot. The threat is some discovered check. If he takes back with the bishop, then check. The king doesn't have any retreat squares, and after knight e7, g6, black is getting mated. If the rook goes to another place, say rook g8, then white can simply play, for example, rook to e3. He will decide at which moment to take the pawn on e6. He can first double the rooks or increase the pressure. Let's say he can further on strengthen the position on the king's flank. He can come with the king in the center if he likes. He can push the pawn. He can do whatever he wants. After rook e3, also one additional thing is that rook to d8 is not a good idea anymore, as then rook f1 is coming, with the point that knight takes e6 is now is a threat, then knight f5 is also a threat. And in case of knight f8 to defend the pawn, knight f5 seems extremely awkward for black because the threat is knight takes g7 check and rook takes f8 mate. So we see the dangers that black is facing, and in the game he decided to take on e6 with the bishop, hoping to trade a pair of white pieces. Like we said, white is not obliged to take on e6. This would be a mistake that will release the pressure. Next move will be, say, rook d8, and the king has a shelter on g8. The rooks are connected. Black is out of danger because the knight is defending the square. g7 pawn is defended by the king. He's just playing rook e8 or even rook d7 and everything will be fine with him. But instead, white is playing for initiative. He plays bishop to b2 again, like before, putting some pressure against the g7 pawn and threatening to jump knight f5 and knight takes g7 in many lines. Again, let me just repeat that important thing. Black cannot really castle because he had lost this opportunity in the opening. If he could after short castling, now he would be having just great position. Everything will be fine. But that's the problem. He cannot connect the rooks. Rook g8, knight f5, threatening the pawn. King f8 more or less forced. Bishop a3 check. King e8 here should have repeated the moves once, bishop b2 and then back to a3. Sorry, actually, no, he played bishop b2, king to f8 and now a spectacular move, rook to d7. He just wants to take all the pawns. Karyakin immediately blundered. He played c5, which was the crucial mistake. He should have taken the rook. This seems like losing on the spot because of the bishop a3 check. If black plays knight e7, there is rook takes e7 and white is harvesting everything on the 7th rank with checks. For instance, c5 takes b6, takes this guy as well. Knight d6 is a threat followed by rook takes f7 mate, and after rook d8 he keeps on taking the pawns on the 7th rank, and also the king is in danger. White is completely winning. But in that case, black had a better defense. After the check on a3 he could have played c5, a very strong intermediate move, bringing the bishop closer to his pawns. After bishop takes c5, now he has to play knight e7, but there is a difference. For example, knight takes e7 is no longer possible with the idea knight g6 mate because of bishop e6, and on knight e5 check. Actually, this is possible. This is one of the tries for white to play for win. He can go for this line if he likes. He will have an extra pawn. But there are still opposite colored bishops on the board, which means that black has some drawing chances. Although, of course, white has the better chances, very good chances to win the game. And this is one thing that white can choose to play for win. Another is, like in the previous line, to take on e7 with the rook. Then b6. This is the move that makes the difference. And if the bishop retreats, then bishop takes f5. And this check is answered c5. Black won an important tempo in that line by bringing the bishop on c5. That's why white needs to play, instead of retreating the bishop, he needs simply to take the bishop on d7, then the pawn on c7 threatening knight to d6 and mate, like in the previous line. And after this possible sequence of moves, rook takes c5, king to e7, knight e4. White is, of course, much better. He has two pawns for the exchange. He has active pieces. In fact, he's threatening knight f6 to trap the rook forever. And still he has great winning chances. But Karyakin needed to go in this line if he wanted to play for draw. What happened in the game was that instead of going to this extremely risky line, he played c5 at once, but he probably blundered this strike. Bishop takes g7. Very strong move. Now black is forced to take it. Sorry, if he takes it, there is rook takes e6, and white is taking back the material. The thing is that that position is completely hopeless for the second player. The pawn on e6 is hanging, those pawns on the 7th rank are hanging, and he can simply resign. That pawn on h5 is also hanging. Soon white will take everything. Instead he played king to e8, but this didn't help neither. He's losing too many pawns. Rook takes c5, bishop takes f5, and an important intermediate check, bringing the bishop back into safety. Bishop f6, king d7, rook takes f5. So white is 2 extra pawns ahead, and he kept the initiative. The rest is very easy. Let's just see how the game concluded. Rook e8, check, king c8, one more check, and the rook occupied the 7th rank, which is also something that he likes. Rook takes f7, rook takes c2, bishop d4. He took that pawn doesn't really matter anymore. The important one is the g5 that is going to be promoted in a minute. Rook a6, bishop f6, knight h4, check, one more check, and after king d8, rook h7, Karyakin resigned. Another danger for the defending player after a possible breakthrough e5 to e6 is the fact that the pieces from behind might get limited and very vulnerable to the remaining white pieces. This is actually what happened in the game Volukitin as white, Andrei Volukitin against Evgeny Alexeyev from the Forest Tournament 2008. It is white to move. Normally he pushes the pawns in the center, tries to limit the light squared bishop, and black took on f5 immediately, which is considered by Volukitin himself a decisive mistake. Most probably black was holding after the immediate bishop c8 with the idea to exchange 2 pairs of pawns rather than 1, and in that case it would be much more difficult for white to do what he did in the game. But let's see what happened there. G takes f5, G takes f5, bishop c8, bishop c3. Already getting ready to push e6. This time he will attack the rook on h8. Black is relieving the defense by exchanging a pair of rooks. This time he doesn't really have a rook on a8 inactive. He has more chances to survive, but still the position is rather difficult for him. White is threatening knight to d5, and after that either knight takes c7 or knight f6. That will be very dangerous for the second player. For example, in case of bishop h6, there is knight d5, bishop takes f5, and e6 is very strong. This natural breakthrough is again giving excellent winning chances for the first player. Rook g8 check, more or less forced, and king h2. An important moment, the f file should be left open, as Volukitin states. It's very good place for the white rook. After bishop g5, knight takes c7, and rook f1, we see why that line was so important. Bishop g6 is more or less forced, e takes f7, and here white starts attacking the black king, and at the end he's going to win at least a pawn. If now king comes to e7, then knight takes g5, and black is losing the rook. And if the king goes to e8, then knight g7 check. Again, king e7 is not a good idea because h4 is trapping the bishop in a spectacular way. It doesn't matter if that bishop is taking the pawn on h4, if it is going to h6 or e3. In all the cases, knight f5 is winning that bishop. Total domination of the white pieces. Finally, if the king goes to f8, then white simply takes the pawn on h5. With an extra pawn and more active pieces, he has all the chances to win that game. That's why in the game, Alexeyev decided to defend in another way, and he played instead the move c6, taking away the d5 square. Now after some preparation, Volukitin will do this standard breakthrough. King f2 first, bringing the king into the center. He's waiting for black also to make a move. In case of bishop h6, there will be knight c4, and the knight can go to the d6 square. We can see that the pieces, black's pieces, are very limited in what they are doing. Just one more move to see that the bishop is in danger here on f5. So bishop h6 is not really developing a piece. Rook g8 was played. King f3, bishop e7, king to e4. And now the white pieces are centralized in a great manner. It's getting more and more difficult for black to defend the position. For example, b5 now can be answered f6, bishop d8, knight f5, further strangling black. The idea is knight g7 check and rook takes d8 mate, or knight d6 is also a threat. And if he exchanges that knight, okay, then e6 is coming on the next move. This time the pawn on f6 is going to be extremely strong and active, probably even promoted. In the game, after king e4, black played rook g3. And this is the moment which I have mentioned before. The pawn breakthrough e5 to e6 is not only giving sometimes immediate results, but in the long run, like it is here after e6, that pawn on e6 can be used for trapping its own bishop. The point behind the move e6 was that white is playing f6, completely limiting the bishop of the opponent, both the bishops actually, because that one on e7 also doesn't have a lot of places to go. If black wants to activate it with bishop d8 and then bishop c7, for example, this loses by force because of f7 and f8 queen. Loses both the bishops. Also rook takes d8 immediately was possible, which means that the bishop is forced to go to a less active position, bishop f8. So that bishop is dominated by the white pawn. The other bishop is limited by the black pawn itself, and it's very, very difficult. Actually, that situation is beyond salvation already for the second player. For example, bishop f8, bishop e5, rook takes h3, f7 check, and now white is winning. If king e7, then check, swap of bishops, and that bishop is finally going off the board. And if the king takes the pawn on f7 at once, king takes f7, then rook d8 is nevertheless trapping the bishop on c8. If black doesn't like to accept the pawn, he can either take rook takes h3, but then f6 is trapping the other bishop, like that, because rook d8 mate is a threat as well. And what happened in the game was that black decided to play bishop g5 immediately, hoping for some activity and eventually even some mating threats with rook e3. Actually, he's already threatening that mate, but with some subtle moves, white proves that he is winning. Knight c4, that d6 square is very important. F takes e6. Not immediately knight d6, because there will be this threat of mate, but first f6. And in case of rook takes h3, white will first play king e5, going away from the mating threat. There is no defense against knight d6 check actually, or f7 check in this position. Even in case of bishop f4 check and rook h4 to take back the piece, white is winning because of king e5. Rook takes c4, rook h1 attacking the pawn, and taking away the g4 square after the move h4 to create decisive threats. Rook g8 is coming, followed by f7, and also the bishop on c8, as we can see, has nowhere to go. Black is just losing. This didn't happen in the game because black decided to play b5 instead on f6, going for some counter chances. Check, king f8. There is no time to take the bishop. This will be a no-full mistake because of the mate, but there is no need to hurry. White can simply swap those bishops, and after that the domination of that knight over the opponent's bishop is becoming obvious. In the game was played, bishop d7 was played, bishop f4, those bishops were swapped, rook takes h3, knight e4, bishop only move is to defend with bishop to e8. Actually, first, sorry, he first gave a check somehow to use the rook into the defense. Now bishop e8, rook d8, the threat is knight d6 to take the bishop and also to mate. Rook e3, king f4, rook e1. Black has completely nowhere to go. Knight d6, the threat is f7. There is no one already to stop this. And after some furthermore checks, Black resigned. He can take the pawn on f6, but he will be mated after rook takes e8. Finally, I would like to share one more positional idea behind the e5, e6 move that was demonstrated by Magnus Carlsen himself against Neidich. And that positional idea is that the e5 square can very well be used by the white pieces, especially the knight. That game was played in 2009 in Dortmund, the Sparkassen GM tournament. In that position, if white simply captures on e7 after king takes e7, no matter where the knight now retreats, let's say knight e2 or knight b3, it doesn't really matter. Black will have perfectly reasonable game after knight e6 because of the blockade, and this is great place for the knight. From there, it can either go to d4 on f4 in the future. It is kind of dominating against the white knight on e2, and black is having a great game. Instead, Carlsen decided to sacrifice the pawn, the pawn, e6, which is very unpleasant for black. In fact, he has to be careful not to lose immediately, as if he takes with the knight, there is bishop takes e7 with two possible lines. If c takes d4, then bishop somewhere back, bishop b4. We know this from the previous samples that king in the center cannot really castle, and black is going to be under tremendous attack after knight takes d4, or even rook takes d4. White can further on win the pawn on h4. And if black instead takes on e7, in that case, white will play knight f5 check, and the rooks are becoming too active. Rook takes e7, etc. So he's simply winning the pawns on the 7th rank because that knight on e6 is hanging. So he cannot take back with the knight on e6. With the other piece, taking back with the bishop is also not a good idea, because in that case either knight b5 or knight f5 even will give great chances for the first player, a great advantage. Knight takes g5, and after that he just takes on e6 and he has all his active pieces on the board, while black has the ruined pawn structure and problems. He didn't even connect the rooks, which means that black is more or less forced to take with the pawn. And he had, first of all, he had ruined the pawn structure. Secondly, there are some weaknesses around his king because of that, which makes it difficult for the second player to develop the pieces. After bishop takes e7, king takes e7, knight f5 check. The only way to stay in the game is to activate the king with king f6, but then knight e3, and Carlsen brought that knight in the center on a dominating position. Knight came to e5, bishop e8, knight g4 check, king e7, knight g to e5. And as a result of this whole operation, we can see that black's pieces have to retreat on a very awkward positions to defend the g6 square. The bishop came here, otherwise that knight will be would always like to jump on g6, and white has great compensation for the sacrificed pawn. Furthermore, what happened was bishop g6, rook d5, spectacular move which wasn't completely necessary. Of course, black cannot take because he's losing a lot of material. Carlsen forced the pawn to go to b6. I'm not sure how effective that is, but it doesn't really matter, as black cannot really go away. King f6, was played f4, and here the most natural move would be to complete the development with knight g6 to connect the rooks. This appeared though to be a decisive mistake, almost, because after knight d7 check, king e7, rook d5 would have given tremendous compensation for the pawn. There will be too many pieces hanging, too many pawns. Rook takes f5 is a threat, so white is really dominating. What I want to say about these Berlin endgames, naturally we already saw, all of us, that the e5 e6 breakthrough is the main concern for the second player, and in black always has to take care about these breakthroughs.